Okay, so Natan, you see the screen that you have in front of you. We're on the third Mishnah of chapter 1. If you want to see the first, the set, what we did last week, I made a copy of it and I can send you a link to it. So you have that as well. So this one begins, Antigonos ish socho, kibel mishimon atzadik. So this individual by the name of Antigonos, who we'll speak about his name in a little bit, received the tradition from Shimon HaTzadik, and he would always say this: don't be like a servant who serves the master in the expectation of receiving a reward, but rather be like a servant who serves a master without the expectation of receiving a reward, and that the fear of heaven be upon you. Before we get to what he actually said, let me just say a couple things about his name and sort of the pedigree with which he comes. So Antigonos, hi Michael. We're just beginning now. We've just read the Mishnah. It should be on your screen. Antigonos ish socho. So the name Antigonos is a little bit of an odd name. It's actually a Greek name. You probably didn't hear me speak about last week, but I said that the early portions of Pirkei Avot is really in response in many regards to the Hellenization, the Greek influence over Jewish society. Shimon HaTzadik's suggestions, for example, in a sense is a response to the Greek values of the time. He says we have to focus on Torah. We have to focus on our unique way of serving God with avodah, and our unique way of interpersonal relationships even. Mike, you have a question? Okay, so the fact that Antigonos has this Greek name should not actually be surprising. In fact, it just reinforces the point we were making last week about the impact of Greek influence on Jewish society. I mentioned last week just I think an interesting historical point. Shimon HaTzadik, who was sort of dealing with this issue of how to deal with Greek influence, Alexander the Great had come and conquered the land and asked that his statue be placed inside the Beit HaMikdash. Shimon HaTzadik did not want to allow that. He couldn't permit it. But at the same time, he didn't want to offend Alexander. He also had a good relationship with Alexander. And so he said that all of the Kohanim, all the priests of that generation would in fact, when they have a male child, they would name their child Alexander. And that's why you have many Jews today with the name Alexander, even though it's a Greek name. It all emanates from that year of Shimon HaTzadik telling the Kohanim to name their firstborns, name their sons Alexander. Antigonos is a similar story. Antigonos, the original Antigonos, the Greek Antigonos, was, I believe, one of the very important ministers in Alexander's army and his governments. So you can see the influence. People in Socho, it's not clear exactly where that is. There's three different opinions. One say it's a little bit south of Hebron. Others suggest it's right in the Elah Valley where David fought Goliath, near there. In either event, in either case, there's another opinion that it's up by Tukaram. In any of these instances, these were Jewish towns, but a Jewish couple found it appropriate to name their child Antigonos because of Greek influence, and presumably it was someone who inspired them on some level. And this Antigonos goes on to become...
It reminds me of Antiochus.
Religious people. Yeah, I'm sorry, Nathan?
It reminds me of Antiochus.
Yeah, Antiochus, right, it's similar. But of course, we don't have too many Jews named Antiochus. Antigonos becomes the leader of the Jewish religious community with a Greek name. And of course, Antigonos is not today so much a popular Jewish name, but Alexander still remains, nevertheless. So he receives it from Shimon HaTzadik. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but recall what Shimon says. Right, there are three things that we need to do Torah, avodah. Avodah is the worship and the service or prayer, and then gimilut chasidim. So Antigonus would say, don't be like servants. Now, before I even get to the rest of the sentence, it doesn't have it here, but in my version, which actually appears in the Kahati, there's a comma right after servants. In other words, most people read this text as don't be like servants who serve the master out of wanting to get a reward, but I read it as don't be servants. If you sort of put it in the context following Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, where we, in a sense, present ourselves to God saying we are either as servants or we are as children. And we hope that you will treat us as children. Antigonus seems to be picking up on that idea. Don't be like servants. Be like, I think, almost in parentheses, be like a child. The goal is to have a relationship with God, not a transactional relationship, and certainly not the distance that exists between a master and a servant. And so that's, I think, one first interpretation we can make. But of course, we have to continue with what he says. And he describes it as, don't be like servants that serve God out of the desire to get a pros, to get some type of reward. I mean, he's really talking about do things for their own sake. Don't do it because of that there's some type of reward or punishment involved in the process. There's a couple things we can say. First of all, one of the verses in the Torah, in Devarim, that says one of the worst things we can do, and the reason why the Jewish people were punished is because we didn't ivdu et Hashem b'simcha. It's not simply that we didn't serve God, but we didn't serve God with the proper intention. We didn't serve God with simcha. That's part of the requirement because that speaks of the relationship. And I think that's what he's really trying to shoot at again and again and again, is that this is all about having a relationship. It's not transactional. The word pras, if you look over in the Bar Tanura, also on the source sheet, Bar Tanura is not just a good wine. It's also a commentary. Rav Ovadia Bar Tanura, he says a pras is something that is given to a person, to a servant, that he is not obligated to give to the person at all. It's like a gift. So the very first thing I think you could say about this fact is that the very fact that we're even talking about a pras, a gift, is to know that if you try to create the relationship as transactional, God, I'll do for you if you do for me, we'll never win, because God has no obligation to give to us at all. And so he says, beware of falling into that trap that says, supposedly I'm going to do something so God then protects me. There's another interpretation of the word pras that I think is even more powerful. Pras is something, a prize that animal trainers would give to animals when they're trying to train them to behave a certain way, right? If you think about B.F. Skinner and behavioral psychology, the famous cases that he was able to teach pigeons how to bowl. And the way he would do it is he would put, some food an inch in front of their beaks, and they would eat it, and they would therefore walk that one step. And then they'd get them the next day to walk 2 steps, and then 3 steps, and then to push the ball. And it was always by giving them a pras to habituate their behavior at each step. Antigonus is very concerned about that. If you're doing mitzvot only because you're being habituated by the pras, well, it still makes you a pigeon. It still makes you an animal doing a trick. And that's not, of course, what mitzvot are about. Some people suggest, if we go back to what Shimon said, and that since Antigonus focuses on the word avodah, don't be like avadim, that he's specifically talking about prayer. And prayer without kavana, prayer without intention, is nothing at all, right? You can't just say the words and not mean them at all and hope that it is going to have an impact. But even if you don't want to go down that way, all our mitzvot have kavana. Not all of them require it. The mitzvah still counts if you give tzedakah even without kavana, but the ideal is to have it with kavana. Because again, when you do something out of love and you really want to do it, it strengthens, one, the relationship with God, and I think also we're rewarded by it, right? It adds much more meaning and depth to our behavior. right? If you go through the motions, let's say on Pesach, and you eat a matzah, and you don't have any of the kavana that this is the bread of affliction, this is the bread of suffering, this is the bread of poverty, and connect with those who might be going through that, so then you're eating a cracker. And the whole Seder, therefore, is much less significant. So first of all, we benefit tremendously by not viewing it in this way. But also, it's, again, the ultimate goal is the relationship that I think God wants us to have with God. David HaMelech in the Psalm, we say, during the 40 days preceding Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, says, Achat she'alti meit Hashem. There's only one thing, avakesh, that I request from God. It's to dwell in the house of the Lord. And then David asked for many other things. I asked for your protection. I asked you to lift me up high. I asked for this. I asked for that. So which is it? Is he asking for one thing or is he asking for many things? And the answer seems to be he's asking for one thing first, the relationship with God. And then he knows from that relationship, everything else follows. I came across a sort of a more modern mashal making the same point about a man who wins a lottery. Right? Let's say he wins $1 million. And so, of course, all his neighbors and his relatives, they all show up at his house and they all put in requests of things that they would like to get from him. They want a new car. I would like you to help me with my mortgage payments. I want this, I want that, I want that. And there's one young man in the corner who's remaining relatively quiet. So he notices this, the man who's won the lottery. He says, I wonder what this guy wants. He says, so tell me, what would you like? He says, all I really want is I want to marry your daughter. I want to have that relationship. So one understands that in that act, right, if in fact he actually married his daughter, he actually gets everything, right? Because he becomes part of the family. He's now on the inside and he would benefit from, whatever finances the person has as well. So the real goal is to have the marriage, to see yourself as a child. Once you have that, so everything else ultimately follows. That's why the Alter Rebbe in Chabad Chassidut says, I don't need Olam Haba. I don't need to return to Gan Eden. I don't want any of those rewards. I simply want God. I simply want the relationship and the closeness with God. And I know whatever that is, everything else will follow, and I need not worry about it in that regard. So I think that's part of what Antigonus is trying to get at by saying, don't serve master for the wanting to get a benefit, but the other way around. I would add one more point on this first part of the Mishnah, which is basically Antigonus is also saying, don't focus on the reward. We assume because it's a better way of serving God not to focus on it. But I would suggest that there's also a danger when you focus on ultimate rewards. What people very often read into Antigonus is he's talking about here the world to come, and right, don't do mitzvot because you're going to get olam haba. Some focus on the here and now, some focus on the world to come. So there is a unfortunate history in the Jewish people that whenever we focus on the world to come, whenever we begin to focus on messianic visions, we often pay the price, whether it's Shabtai Tzvi or other times as well with false messiahs. But on a more practical level, when you focus on the afterlife, Judaism absolutely always says there's an afterlife. There is a reward. Notice that Antigonus never says you won't be rewarded. He simply says don't focus on it. Don't let that be the intention when you do mitzvot. But he never says it doesn't exist. But when people do focus on the afterlife, very often they withdraw.
How come they don't talk much about the afterlife in the books?
Okay, so that's what I'm going to offer a suggestion right now. It's a little bit based upon the Rambam's thinking that if you focus on the afterlife, there's a tendency to withdraw from this world a little bit, right? Meaning if there's, let's say, suffering in this world, well, if it's all going to be made better by the justice that one receives in the world to come, so then perhaps you become more passive in dealing with the suffering in this particular world. And that happens in many religions. There are many religions that say, oh, everything's going to be okay in the world to come. So therefore, if I see a child dying of a terrible disease in this world, well, they're going to go to a better place. So Judaism has always shied away against that value, and says, no, you have to make this world as good as possible. You have to focus on the here and now. And so perhaps that's one of the motivations or one of the explanations of why many Jews, for example, go into the medical profession, for example, or other professions that try to correct the here and now. Because we can't be satisfied with simply the answer that the child will be in a better place once they pass away, that they'll go to Olam Haba. No, if there's suffering now, if there's injustice now, it has to be taken care of in this world. That's the mission that God has given us. So therefore, it's not that we reject the world to come, but we do reject the focus on the world to come, because it ultimately has almost an immoral impact on this particular world. Now, I should say, as an aside, I once heard Dennis Prager speak about this point. He says that very often our greatest strengths are also our weakest or most problematic qualities. So he gives the example of people flying down on a plane from New York to Florida or Iowa to some other Midwestern town. He assumes that there'll be a lot of Jews on the New York to Florida flight. And he says, if you were a stewardess, which flight would you prefer? And he suggests that perhaps all these Jews might complain a little too much on the New York to Florida leg. The point he's really making is that Jews complain. They see something wrong and they want to make it better. And so he says that's a negative sometimes. Our food is not prepared well enough. My service is not good enough. Perhaps there's this stereotype of Jews complaining, but maybe there's hidden within that stereotype actually an important value, and that is that Jews complain when they see something wrong. So maybe we have to overcome it on these petty matters, but on the large matters in life, it actually says something quite positive about the Jewish people, that we can't stand injustice. And so therefore, that emanates from not focusing on something that would automatically correct and justify the terrible things in this world. So that's one answer to your question of why we don't necessarily focus on it and why it doesn't appear in the books. But as the Rambam writes explicitly, but of course, we absolutely believe it. It's one of the principles of our faith. But right behind that is the idea of not to talk too much about it, not to make calculations about it, but rather to live in the here and now. Now, I want to get to the second half of the Mishnah, because after he basically focuses on we should do it for the right reasons, we should follow mitzvot out of love, we should do it because we have the intentions when we do our mitzvot, he then says something which is almost like a twist ending. V'hi mora shamayim aleichem, and the fear of heaven should be placed upon you. Now, everything up until now has been talking about love. All of a sudden now he begins to speak about fear. One answer could be based upon what we were just talking about, the tension of talking about the afterlife as a reward and not talking about it. In Antigonus, we were told that two students, Zadok and Baitos, and the theory goes, misinterpreted what Antigonus said. Antigonus didn't say that there is no afterlife, there is no Olam Haba, but he didn't focus on it. They heard in that lack of statement, maybe there's no afterlife at all. And therefore they said, that can't be. That seems terribly unfair. Here is a person who does work. Shouldn't a worker who works all day get paid their salary? Now notice, remember what he actually said. He didn't say that you shouldn't work in order to receive your schar, your salary, but rather your pras, which we described as a gift that you don't necessarily even deserve. But they heard it as mitzvot is a type of labor, a type of work, and you deserve to be paid for it. And Antigonus is saying, no, you're not going to get paid. Again, that's not what he said, but that's what they heard. So they leave Antigonus. They say, this whole thing can't make sense. They reject a great deal of Judaism. They try to bring other people on their way. And some believe that Baitos, this particular student Baitos, who subsequently in Jewish history, we'll see that his followers tried to uproot Judaism. They're the ones who, if you remember, when it comes to Rosh Chodesh, the way Rosh Chodesh was announced in the days of old is that people would go up on top of mountains and light a Rosh Chodesh fire, a bonfire, to identify, so it could be identified on the next mountain over, who would then put up a bonfire and the next mountain over, and that's how news would spread that Rosh Chodesh was declared in the court in Yerushalayim, that Baitos, the followers, they used to put it up on the wrong day to throw off the entire Jewish calendar. So others suggest that Baitos, once they felt that there's no world to come, they said we should only live in the here and now. Let's be, and some believe that Epicurus thought is basically a intellectual descendant of Baitos, that says you should just live in the physical, enjoy the physical pleasures, the material world. That's all we have. Now, I would point out that Antigonus is actually arguing for the here and now more so than even Baitos, because he's saying when you do mitzvot, don't look over your shoulder. Don't look to the next mitzvah. Don't look to the next reward. Just focus on this particular mitzvah and try to derive the joy and the meaning in this particular act. He's saying focus right here, now. Experience this. It's when you're looking over your shoulder to the next experience is when you're robbed of the present. And so actually, I think that Antigonus is actually arguing very strongly for the here and now, but Baitos felt not. Baitos felt we should just focus on the material because that's all we ultimately have. So some people suggest that Antigonus's original statement did not include the ending, V'hi morad, let the fear of heaven be upon you. He simply said the first things, don't serve God out of desire to get a reward. He noticed that his students, Tzadok and Baitos, went the wrong way. And so therefore he had an addendum of let the fear of heaven be upon you. It's almost like as a corrective that you should still have the fear of God. You should still realize that even though I don't think you should have the intention for getting a reward when you do mitzvot, know that there is reward and punishment. And he placed that on there almost as a corrective. Rabbi Joseph Talishkin has, I think, a great insight with regards to Shammai. We'll see Shammai a little bit later, who we usually think of as sort of a very strict individual, right? He's the one who beats the convert, the potential convert, who says, teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one leg, and he beats him and says, it can't be done. So Shammai is also the individual in Pirkei Avot who says, greet every person with a smiling face, a panim yafot, with a happy, welcoming, warm countenance. So you could say, wait a second, that doesn't strike to me about Shammai at all. Unless you perhaps believe maybe Shammai realized his natural inclination was to be negative, was to, scare people away with a scouring face. And so he was working on that and convincing himself that he always had to greet people with a smiling face, that he was speaking to himself because he saw the negative impact of how he behaved previously. So if that's the case, maybe this is parallel. Maybe Antigonus realized that he had to at least say, remember, there is reward and punishment. There is morale. You should make sure to have the fear of heaven, and there is reward and punishment. I, however, would like to suggest that his understanding of morale, really, fear is awe, right? And that it's a continuation of the same thing. The reason why you do these mitzvot is because of the awe you have of God. God is not your boss, right? Odysseus, right? If we talk about Greek influence, when Homer speaks of Odysseus, he describes a master as someone who has to be on your back all the time, because otherwise the servant would never do anything at all. He would only do it because he's being forced by the master. But that's not meant to be our relationship with God. We're doing it because we have this love relationship with God. It's as if, the king of the world, right? If the president says, Natan, I need your advice on something. I want you to do something for me. You run to do it. You're excited to do it. So similarly, that's how our relationship should be with God. We want to do it. So morah could be almost a continuation of that concept of love because it's awe. Now, I should point out, however, That's not what the Bartanura says. If you look again to the side, he says, Mora afal pi she'ata oved me'ava. Even though you normally serve God out of love, oved gam ken miyira. It's also valuable to serve God sometimes out of fear. He says, she'oved me'ava zariz b'mitzvot aseh, that love helps you fulfill mitzvot that are positive in nature. It gives you the proper kavana, intention, to go that extra step when it's an aseh, a positive mitzvah. But sometimes you need ha'oved miyira, but sometimes you need the fear that it helps you warn and protect you from negative mitzvah. You know, in theory, if I'm driving in a car, I try not to speed because I do it out of ahava, out of love for my fellow passengers, for the fellow people on the roads. I want to be careful and everything like that. But I'll admit, sometimes, you know, growing up in the U.S., on a big open highway where there was no one around for, you know, miles and miles and miles, I would speed. But when I would think that there might be a police officer with a speed check, a radar, I would slow down. That fear of getting the ticket made me behave a little bit better. Sometimes love in itself is not enough. You need the negative fear as well. So that's what the Bartanura says. I would put a positive spin on fear as well. There's a number of studies that point out that while many people think fear is debilitating, it sort of destroys you, it sort of tries to crush your spirit and humbles you, and that's how you should be serving God. I would argue that sometimes fear can liberate you. So for example, fear of God in particular. So for example, there are studies during the Holocaust about non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jewish lives. There are very few people who did so, but many of the people who did so were religious Christians. And the question is, why did they risk their lives to save Jews? And when they were interviewed, many of them pointed out that obviously you should do it out of love of your fellow human beings. But you know, when the Nazis threatened to kill you, if you save a Jewish person, there's a great deal of fear. And sometimes that fear conquers the love. So why did they then save the Jews anyway? So some of them argued and said, because as fearful as I was of the Nazis, I was more fearful of what God would do to me if I didn't fulfill the mitzvah, the commandment of saving another life. That their fear of God and the potential punishment of not behaving appropriately liberated them from the fear of man. And so in many respects, when Antigona says, and let the fear of heaven be upon you, perhaps what he's also arguing is that if you have the fear of heaven, don't view that as a negative. That will liberate you from the fear of everything else in this world. And that will enable you to be free to fulfill the mitzvot, not out of the desire for reward or even the reward, the possibility of punishment, but it would enable you just to have that relationship with God and seek that as much as you could say. I would close simply by offering you what the Maharal says on this particular idea. He notes, and you'll notice before, the last week's Mishnah was all about Shimon HaTzadik and what he teaches. It was one person. And Antigonus is one person. If you see the next Mishnah, there's now two people, and this is what's called the pairs. There will be a pair of two teachers going forward from here on out. So next week you'll see Yossi ben Yoyezer, Ish Tzaraida, Yossi ben Yochanan, Ish Yerushalayim. There's two people. So the Maharal says, Antigonus is the last person who is able to combine both Ahava and Yira in one person. You see, both of those ways of serving God have great value. But our natural tendency is to favor one or the other. There are some people who favor love a little bit more, some people who favor fear a little bit more. Antigonus had the great ability to combine both of these ideas. After him, we unfortunately sort of go down in holiness, and so we need to have both people teaching, one focusing a little bit more on the Ava element and one focusing a little bit more on the Yira, the fear element. But Antigonus possessed both of those ideas, and so therefore, in his writing here, he includes both of them in his teachings. For him, it's not a conflict at all. Serve God out of love, serve God out of awe and fear. They're actually one and the same thing. It's all about having that close relationship with God. Okay, so anyway, that's where I'm going to end here. If you have any questions, of course, I'm more than happy to answer any of those.